Alan Rusbridger spent 2 decades as the editor-in-chief of The Guardian, where he oversaw the publication of WikiLeaks and the Edward Snowden files. So when he speaks about journalists needing to find some nerve, you can assume he knows what he's talking about. Lately, the target of his great concern has been the BBC, the venerable British broadcaster that keeps seeming to find itself in the middle of messy political controversies, many of its own making. Earlier this year, the BBC pulled down a documentary about life inside Gaza when it was revealed that a narrator was the son of a Hamas official. Then, more recently, it refused to air a film about Israeli attacks on doctors inside the Gaza Strip, over vague concerns about its impartiality. That film has been well received over on Channel 4, a competitor who ultimately ran it. In all of these episodes, there's something for everyone to dislike, and it's perhaps no surprise that the BBC is one of those institutions, kind of like the New York Times here, that's become a universal punching bag. The key to getting out of this rut, Rusbridger believes, is for the people in charge to return to the kind of fearless journalism that the world so badly needs. Whether that's truly possible these days is another question entirely. Well, Alan, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
I'm really pleased to be here.
I thought this was a good week for us to have a conversation about the BBC, which I know is a topic that you've paid quite a lot of attention to, but of course is having this sort of acute moment. Maybe there's always one, but it's in the eye of the storm right now. I wonder, maybe for the purposes of our audience, do you think you could give just sort of your synopsis of what the current controversy is with the BBC?
Sure. Well, the BBC is more or less universally available in the UK. It's simultaneously the most trusted media organisation in the country, and probably the most controversial because lots of people find reasons to disagree with it or protest about it at any one point.
Right.
But there are 3 simultaneous rows about its coverage of Gaza in particular that have coincided in different ways. The first one was a documentary about Gaza made by local people, which was transmitted and then withdrawn when it was found that one of the narrators of the program was the son of a Hamas official.
Right.
And there's now a long inquiry which has not yet been published into that. Then came a second Gaza documentary, which was about medics under attack. And the BBC came under attack because it didn't transmit that without really giving any convincing explanation of why not.
Right.
And the third thing that has happened is the BBC every year does wall-to-wall coverage of the Glastonbury Festival. And this year it failed to pull the plugs on a rap duo called Bob Villain with a V rather than a D, as they got the crowd to chant death to the IDF. It was a sort of call and answer thing, and people wondered why on earth the BBC didn't press the mute button or in some way stop transmitting what was generally held to be a very offensive moment. So these 3 things have converged, and they're all different, but they have combined to create a massive headache for the BBC.
Well, but they're all different, but in this particular case, they all sort of align with one topic and one sort of issue with how they've handled this one topic, right? Is your sense that the problem is an internal one, or is it an external one? Is it people finding things to be outraged about here that, or is it how they've responded to that outrage?
A bit of each, I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, the organisation is under the microscope in a way that most media organisations would hate, I think. And there are more or less round-the-clock lobbying groups who are examining every single inch or second of footage. So it comes under the microscope in a way that probably other media organisations don't. The Israeli side of the argument, if I can put it like that, claims that the BBC is institutionally biased against Israel. There's been recently a report claiming the opposite, that the BBC is institutionally biased in favor of Israel.
Right. Those of us who follow, maybe we can talk about this, but those of us who follow the New York Times more closely are very familiar with this dynamic.
Yeah.
Right?
And of course, depending on which narrative you prefer, these three examples are shining examples of whatever it is that you're trying to prove about the BBC. I mean, the BBC is slightly on the back foot because its Director General, who is effectively the editor-in-chief, it's an enormous and difficult job because there are just hundreds of hours of broadcasts going out every week. And the guy in charge hasn't got a journalistic background. He came from a marketing background. And so some people are complaining and saying he doesn't have the sure touch that would have enabled him to grip these problems earlier.
I mean, are you among those, I assume?
I think it's a very, very difficult job. The budget is something like £3 billion. So that's well over $4 billion. And you need somebody with, an enormous commercial and managerial experience to run an organization of that size. And to expect someone also to be the editor-in-chief and to be making sometimes minute-by-minute decisions on content is a big ask of anyone. I think Tim Davie, who has the job, I think the sure touch has been lacking.
Well, I mean, I want to avoid, I think, for the moment, or set aside for a moment, the big question, the impossible question of is the BBC too pro-Israel or too pro-Hamas? Because I'm sure there's no real answer, or it's just both, right? Or it's neither, or whatever. But I think there's some more specific problems with the way the BBC is trying to approach its business that you can get at, that you've written about, that you can get at through these stories. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of your recent pieces for the Prospect about this idea that the BBC is sort of compromised at heart when it's trying to deal with these issues. Like what was the story there?
Well, it's such a sort of big and unusual. I think it's probably fair to call it a unique organization.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it is supposed to be, although there's people who don't like it. So, somebody who doesn't like it, for instance, is Rupert Murdoch. He doesn't believe the BBC should really exist. So
Mm-hmm.
he and his children tend to refer to it as a state broadcaster and imply that it's some sort of, socialist creation which is stopping the free market from doing what it wants. And I don't think that's true, but in order to prove that it's not true, the BBC has to show that it is entirely independent from government. That's difficult because the government of the day has the right to appoint about a third of the board which oversees it. And there are some controversial figures on that board. And so it's simultaneously difficult for the BBC to say we are completely independent from government when the government, under the present constitution, picks so many members of the board. So that's a problem for it.
Right.
And there's also some very arcane aspects of the governance. So at the moment, you can only watch the BBC if you have a license. Until recently, a BBC license was tied to the purchase of a television set. Well, that's clearly
A quaint, let's call it a quaint model.
it's a quaint model. Yeah.
Yeah.
But at some point, they're going to have to change the funding model, and no government has yet grasped that.
Right.
And the Conservative government that was in power for 14 years was really pretty hostile to the whole notion of the BBC and imposed a series of cuts, of about 30% cuts on the overall budget.
But cuts and rate freezes, and also
All that.
eliminating subsidies on some of the older viewers who are such a key part of the demographic, I would
That,
assume.
and cutting back the World Service, which
Yeah.
we know that's a contested space, but an exercise in soft power. So I think it feels a beleaguered organization. And I think beleaguered journalistic organizations need strong leaders who are going to show some backbone and bravery and courage and do great work. And I mean, what happened with the third film, which was about the doctors under attack,
Mm-hmm.
when the BBC didn't show it, Channel 4 picked it up and showed it. And the general reaction I saw was, well, why on earth didn't the BBC show this? The BBC is now gutless on top of everything else. And so I'm sure if Tim Davie thinks I can't win, whatever I do, I get criticized for.
Well, but I mean, not to get stuck on this, but I mean, it does seem like a pretty important moment, right? I mean, I watched some of that documentary and I stopped watching it, actually, frankly, because it was very hard to watch, but not because I didn't think it was journalistically sound. I just thought it was very painful
Yeah,
viewing.
that's the problem. The critics of the BBC say, look, here is a man. The organisation has clearly made a mistake with the first documentary. At the very least, they should have found out that the narrator had a relationship with Hamas and should have declared that. Whether that would have satisfied all the critics or not, we don't know. But and it feels as though the BBC then lost its nerve and thought, well, we can't put out a second documentary, which might come under attack. And so they bottled it. And this is not great if you're working at the BBC and the public is demanding quality work, brave work, that you do all the things that journalists should do. I think there's a sense within the BBC that are their bosses going to back them if they do bold and uncompromising work?
I wonder if the problem here is specifically that the BBC in this moment is politically compromised in some way. And we haven't mentioned the name Robbie Gibb, which I would be curious to have you talk about a little bit because I know you've written about him a decent amount. But I wonder if the problem is the specifics of what's happening now or over the last decade or so, or if it's in the nature of trying to have a news organization like this by being this sort of neutral, broad, state supported institution. You kind of can't do anything. You end up paralyzed.
Well, I think because it is so much under the spotlight. So 25 years ago, at the time of the Iraq War, a reporter made what you could casually call a mistake at 6 o'clock in the morning. That mistake resulted in a judge-led inquiry costing £3 million and the dismissal of the Director General and the chairman. And I think when that kind of pressure is put on an organization by the government of the day, then the incentives within the organization become, arse covering.
Was this the David Kelly
That's the
story
David
too?
Kelly.
Which was an awful story
It
too.
was an awful
Just
story. Somebody died. The BBC refused to apologise, and it led to a gigantic standoff between a Labour government and the BBC, and this enormous judge-led inquiry.
right. Just to be clear for those listening, I mean, we are not talking about a conservative Tory government doing
No,
this. This
that
was a
that that,
Labour government,
that
and so
was
the point you're making is that this was an early time of government really coming to bear on the BBC, and
it,
it wasn't from the right, actually.
it was from a Labour government. And I think there's a sense, my feeling is that the BBC has never really recovered its nerve since then. And that's why you really need a strong leader, a strong editorial leader who is going to back the journalism. And, 14 years of governments sort of threatening the BBC with cuts or with not abolition, no one's quite gone that far, but the sense that a government can really rein the BBC in, I think is really problematic. I mean, you mentioned Robbie Gibb. I can't imagine many American listeners would have heard of him, but
No, I'm certain not, but I've read his
so,
name now many times in your pages, so I
so
I think it's where I would be interested
okay.
in
So
in
the
you
story
telling
here
us. Yeah.
is that the Boris Johnson government imposed, because they have the right to pick a certain number of directors, imposed on the BBC Sir Robbie Gibb, who had been the press secretary to Theresa May, the Prime Minister. So that's quite a thing to do to an organisation that is supposed to be politically impartial, is to put the man who was the press secretary to the Prime Minister.
I mean, the British papers call him a spin doctor. That's
Yeah,
the term,
I mean,
right?
he makes
So,
no pretense of being impartial. He had been a BBC journalist earlier, and he goes on to the Central Committee, which looks at editorial guidelines and standards, and he's the only external journalist on this 5-person committee. So he's immediately in a very influential position. But what makes him really problematic is that mysteriously, about 5 years ago, he led a consortium to buy Britain's leading Jewish paper, the Jewish Chronicle.
right.
He became the owner of it without ever declaring who the actual owner was or where the money came from. And that paper then became engulfed in a series of mishaps and scandals. involving twice the regulator threatening to launch a standards investigation into it, 5 of the leading columnists walking out of it, saying this had become just a propaganda sheet for the Likudnik Israeli coalition government. And then finally, just after Robbie Gibbs stepped down from his position of chairing it, a full-blown scandal when it published a wholly fabricated story which seems to have been leaked from somebody within Netanyahu's office. So
this is in the aftermath of October 7, and that was actually, that one was quite a large story, at least in those of us who pay attention to the media. That was a pretty big story.
Somebody's been arrested in Israel, accused of that leak. So somebody who doesn't pretend to be impartial on the Middle East sits on the committee that has now launched an inquiry into the BBC's coverage of the Middle East. And that seems to me just plain wrong. I mean, if you're trying to talk about impartiality of the BBC, you can't have as your only, until recently, the only journalist on the editorial committee, somebody who is so plainly partial, both politically and in terms of the Middle East. And of course, this just leads to further undermining of people who claim the BBC is not acting as it should be.
Well, I guess that leads me back to because of that sort of specific situation. I guess that keeps me coming back to the question of, is the problem one that can be fixed by addressing these specific individuals and somebody saying, okay, I'm gonna stand up and do proper journalism the way it should be done, and I'm not gonna be afraid of political influence? Or is it something more fundamental about the nature of the BBC that just kind of can't be fixed?
I think it's fundamental, and I think, I mean, the Starmer government has got off to a very bad start and has had its hands full in many ways, but it has 4 more years, and I think it should put the BBC onto a proper footing, work out its funding arrangements, change the governance arrangements so that you get rid of this ludicrous aspect where the government can appoint directors to the BBC, and free it up, make it truly independent, and then hope that the BBC can find a leader strong enough to lead it into a brighter future, because it feels, as I said earlier, really beleaguered at the moment.
Now, are you also advocating going more private? I mean, there's been this move in the United States, at least, and that's obviously quite a different market for the BBC, but there's now a paywall. There's other ways that they take advertising for podcasts they do, which are great. Many of them are terrific. Is that a model you think the BBC should move towards, or is it important to retain the public funding aspect?
I don't mind charging people abroad for the BBC. That seems to me perfectly fair. But the essential bit of the BBC is that it's universally available. And that's never been more important in a world in which people no longer know who to believe and the world is swilling with mis and disinformation. Actually having a broadcaster, which I think the latest figures are at least 60 to 65% of people say they trust, is essential.
Mm-hmm.
It's
that's a remarkable number, by the way.
It's a remarkable
hard.
Yeah.
I dare you to find a place like that in the States.
But despite all, I mean, and it's way more trusted than any print newspaper. It's got remarkable levels of trust. If the Labour government had any sense, they would use the next 4 years to put the BBC on a sort of bomb-proof footing, because I think the world of information is going to get ever more murkier, and the sense that people are going to be completely at the mercy of quite malign forces. Having an organization available to everyone, where you've got whatever the quibbles at the margins, the BBC content is pretty reliable, and if it's on the BBC, it's much more than less likely to be true. Actually becomes a matter of national interest.
I mean, the challenge that arises is how far is a state-backed media organization able to go to push this? Because we have this problem. I'm thinking about Brexit also as an example, where the ideal that I think probably has guided the BBC in many ways, this may be a false assumption, but this idea of that, we want to, in a very fair way, present how both sides view things. When one of the sides is is not telling the truth. Like, that creates a really fundamental problem that I think we're all reckoning with, but I wonder if it's an even bigger challenge for the BBC.
Well, I think it's a particular problem in the UK. So you're probably aware that the UK is almost the mirror image of America in the sense that the newspapers are highly partisan and very political and polemical, whereas the broadcaster is attempts at least to be straight down the middle.
Right.
Whereas, the common perception of America is that papers try to be impartial, and then you've got the sort of wild west of broadcasting, which is wholly partial.
Right. Not exactly true, but I see your
But
point there,
as a
of
broad
course. Yeah. Yeah.
generalization.
It's actually an interesting point. Yeah.
So if you've got the papers in the national papers in Britain are very left or very right comment and reporting, and Brexit is a brilliant point. Brexit was a time where what you wanted from journalism was to present both sides of the argument, point the pitfalls as well as the opportunities of Brexit. And then if you wanted, as a final thing, to say, by the way, this is what we think, that would have been a nice cherry on top. Most papers did the exact opposite. They said, we know how you should vote, and we're going to use our front pages for the next 6 months to ram that home week after week, and we're not going to give both sides because we don't believe in the other side. And so, to me, it was a massive failure of journalism, and we really needed the BBC to do a job of doing what journalism should have done. I think the same is true of climate change, by the way.
Sure. Yeah.
And so the role of an organization like the BBC becomes more essential in a world in which there's a very different idea of what journalism is in much of the press.
Yeah. It's a challenge that we're facing here. I mean, I think to bring it back to the Times also, right? I mean, it's part of the challenge the Times is facing, I think, is that there's a real disconnect between what the Times envisions itself to be and the role it thinks it ought to play in journalism, and what so many of the new subscribers in the Trump era want it to be. They want it to be this thing that shuts down all of the falsehoods from the right, the ivermectin vaccine fallacies, the election fraud stories. It leaves me wondering, I guess the question, on some level is there a value in these institutions whose role it is to kind of be a punching bag for all sides?
I think they're essential. I mean, I think you're right that, and I think it goes more broadly than the Times or the BBC. We're very bad as journalists explaining what our craft involves. And unfortunately, we've got a linguistic problem that we call everything journalism, but Fox News's idea of journalism is very different from the Financial Times or the New York Times' idea of journalism, yet we call it all journalism. And the story we want the public to believe is that we have this craft, this toolbox that will get at the truth. You should trust us because we've got these techniques that get at the truth. And yet clearly there are very different journalistic ideas of how you do that. So almost before you can do your work, you have to find ways of explaining how you do your work and why you should be believed. And I don't think journalism is rising to the challenge at the moment. But, as I said earlier, the BBC starts from the position of actually being highly trusted. That's less of a problem for the BBC than for any other media organisation in Britain. And I think it should be cherished and set free because there are so many malign sharks circling who would like to destroy it, really.
It's easy to read your columns and think, oh, this is a critic of the BBC, but I think fundamentally you are a believer in the BBC.
Oh, absolutely. No, I love and cherish the BBC and believe it is vital. So, my criticism of it comes from a position of love and respect, but I think it's not distinguishing itself at the moment.
Just generally looking at the media landscape in the States right now, the pressures from the administration, there's some threats that are seen to be kind of directed towards Sullivan, that case, and the First Amendment protections that the press has. I guess I wonder, how concerned are you about the state of press freedom in America, and how much does that matter to you?
Really quite concerned. The economic threat to the local press is dire. The cave-ins by the major broadcasters are dismaying. lack of solidarity around the position of AP in the White House pool. I mean, I think there should be much more concerted pushback, so that if the Trump administration tries to pick off individual players, there should be, I think, a concerted pushback. So I think that there are alarming signs of loss of nerve, clearly deep problems around the questions of corporate ownership. I'm thinking of the Washington Post, CBS, some of the big social media players. So I think it's a very bleak time.
Loss of nerve is the recurring theme, actually, which I think is interesting. That seems to be almost the canary in the coal mine for you about media institutions.
Yeah, and I had the good fortune 20 years stayed at The Guardian, which had no proprietor and had a trust to protect the journalistic work. And so I feel wonderfully privileged. So I don't want to lecture people who work in a less privileged way. But I do think, when you look at the equivalent attack on the law firms, and I think people now think if only the law firms had binded together and presented a unified front and defied the kind of pressure that they were coming under, that we'd all be in a much better place today. And I sort of think that about the media companies as well. It's difficult because journalists are very competitive, and their natural inclination is not to combine or collaborate. But I think maybe we have to change our ways a bit.
Alan, thank you so much for your time today.
Not at all. I enjoyed it.
The Kicker is brought to you by the Columbia Journalism Review and produced by Amanda Dara. I'm your host, Josh Hirsch.